Chapter 5. Luella and her mother are mystified. They had not long to wait. They heard the elevator door slide softly open, and then the gentle swish of silken skirts. Luella looked around just in time to be recognised by young Mr. Grandon, if he had not, at that moment, been placing a long white broadcloth coat about his mother's shoulders. There were 4 in the party, and Luella's heart sank. He would not be likely to ask another one. The young man and the grey silk thread lace woman from the other dining table were going with them, it appeared. Young Mr. Grandon helped the grey silk lady down the steps, while the handsome stranger walked by Mrs. Grandon. They did not look around at the people on the piazza at all. Luella bit her lips in vexation. "For pity's sake, Luella, don't scowl so," whispered her mother. "They might look up yet and see you." This warning came just in time, for young Mr. Grandon, just as he was about to start the car, glanced up and, catching Luella's fixed gaze, gave her a distant bow, which was followed by a courteous lifting of the stranger's hat. Aunt Crete was seated beside Mrs. Grandon in the back seat and beaming her joy quietly. She was secretly exulting that Luella and Carrie had not been in evidence yet. She felt that her joy was being lengthened by a few minutes more, for she could not get away from the fear that her sister and niece would spoil it all as soon as they appeared upon the scene. "I thought Aunt Carrie and Luella would be tired after their all-day trip, and we wouldn't disturb them tonight," said Donald in a low tone, looking back to Aunt Crete as the car glided smoothly out from the shelter of the wide piazza. Aunt Crete smiled happily back to Donald, and raised her eyes with a relieved glance toward the rows of people on the piazza. She had been afraid to look her fill before, lest she should see Luella frowning at her somewhere, but evidently they had not got back yet, or perhaps had not finished their dinner. As Aunt Crete raised her eyes, Luella and her mother looked down into her upturned face enviously, but Aunt Crete's gaze had but just grazed them, and fallen upon an old lady of stately mien with white fluffy hair like her own, and a white crepe de chine gown trimmed with much white lace. In deep satisfaction Aunt Crete reflected that, if Luella had aught to say against her aunt's wearing modest white morning gowns, she would cite this model, who was evidently an old aristocrat, if one might judge by her jewels and her general make-up. "Somewhere I've seen that woman with the grey silk," exclaimed Luella's mother suddenly as Aunt Crete swept by. "There's something real familiar about the set of her shoulders. Look at the way she raises her hand to her face. My land, I believe she reminds me of your Aunt Crete." "Now, Mother," scorned Luella, "as if Aunt Crete could ever look like that. You must be crazy to see anything in such an elegant lady to remind you of poor old Aunt Crete. Why, Ma, this woman is the real thing. Just see how her hair's put up. Nobody but a French maid could get it like that. Imagine Aunt Crete with a French maid. Oh, I'd die laughing. She's probably washing our country cousin's supper dishes at this very minute. I wonder if her conscience doesn't hurt her about my lavender organdy. Say, Ma, did you notice how graceful that handsome stranger was when he handed the ladies into the car? My, but I'd like to know him. I think Clarence Grandon is just a stuck-up prig." Her mother looked at her sharply. "Luella, seems to me you change your mind a good deal. If I don't make any mistake, you came down here so as to be near him. What's made you change your mind? He doesn't seem to go with any other girls." "No, he just sticks by his mother every living minute," sighed Luella unhappily. "I do wish I had that lavender organdy. I look better in that than anything else I've got. I declare I think Aunt Crete is real mean and selfish not to send it. I'm going in to see if the mail has come, and if the organdy isn't here, nor any word from Aunt Crete, I'm going to call her up on the telephone again." Luella vanished into the hotel office, and her mother sat and rocked with puckered brows. She very much desired a place in high society for Luella, but how to attain it was the problem. She had not been born for social climbing and took hardly to it. Meantime, the motor car rolled smoothly over the perfect roads, keeping always that wonderful gleaming sea in sight, and Aunt Crete, serenely happy, beamed and nodded to the pleasant chat of Mrs. Grandon, and was so overpowered by her surroundings that she forgot to be overpowered by the grand Mrs. Grandon. As in a dream, she heard the kindly tone and responded mechanically to the questions about her journey and the weather in the city and how lovely the sea was tonight. But as she spoke the few words with her lips, her soul was singing, and the words of its song were these: "Must I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas?" And it seemed to her, as they glided along the palace-lined shore, with the rolling sea on one hand and the beautiful people in their beautiful raiment at ease and happy on the other hand, that she was picked right up out of the hot little brick house in the narrow street and put on a wonderfully flowery bed of ease, and was floating right into a heaven of which her precious Donald was a bright, particular angel. She forgot all about Luella and what she might say, and just enjoyed herself. She even found herself telling the elegant Mrs. Grandon exactly how she made piccalilli, and her heart warmed to the other woman as she saw that she was really interested. She had never supposed, from the way in which Luella spoke of the Grandons, that they would even deign to eat such a common thing as a pickle, let alone knowing anything about it. Aunt Crete's decision was that Mrs. Grandon wasn't stuck up in the least, but just a nice common lady like anyone, and as she went up in the elevator beside her and said good night, she felt as if she had known her all her life. It was not until she had turned out her light and crept into the great hotel bed that it came to her to wonder whether Luella and Carrie could be meant by the ones in the hymn, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas. She couldn't help feeling that perhaps she had been selfish in enjoying her days so much, when for aught she knew Luella might not be having a good time. For Luella not to have a good time meant blame for her aunt generally. Ever since Luella had been born, it had been borne in upon Aunt Crete that there was a moral obligation upon her to make Luella have a good time. And now Aunt Crete was having a good time, the time of her life, and she hugged herself, she was so happy over it, and thought of the dear stars out there in the deep, dark blue of the arching sky, and the cool, dark roll of the white-tipped waves, and was thankful. Luella and her mother had gloomily watched the dancing through the open windows of the ballroom, but, as they knew no one inside, they did not venture in. Luella kept one eye out for the return of the car, but somehow missed it, and finally retired to the solace of cold cream and the comforts of the fourth-floor back, where lingered in the atmosphere a reminder of the dinner past and a hint of the breakfast that was to come. As the elevator ascended past the second floor, the door of one of the special apartments stood wide, revealing a glimpse of the handsome young stranger standing under the chandelier reading a letter, his face alive with pleasure. Luella sighed enviously, and in her dreams strove vainly to enter into the charmed circle where these favoured beings moved, and knew not that of her own free will she had closed the door to that very special apartment, which might have been hers but for her own action. The next morning Luella was twisting her neck in a vain endeavour to set the string of artificial puffs straight upon the enormous cushion of her hair, till they looked for all the world like a pan of rolls just out of the oven. She had jerked them off 4 separate times, and pulled the rest of her hair down twice in a vain attempt to get just the desired effect, and her patience, never very great at any time, was well nigh exhausted. Her mother was fretting because the best pieces of fish and all the hot rolls would be gone before they got down to breakfast, and Luella was snapping back in most undaughterly fashion, when a noticeable tap came on the door. It was not the tap of the chambermaid of the fourth-floor back, nor of the elevator boy, who knew how to modulate his knock for every grade of room from the second story, ocean front, up and back. It was a knock of rare condescension, mingled with a call to attention, and it warned these favoured occupants of room 410 to sit up and take notice, not that they were worthy of any such consideration as was about to fall upon them. Luella drove the last hairpin into the puffs and sprang to the door just as her mother opened it. She felt something was about to happen. Could it be that she was invited to ride in that automobile at last, or what? There in the hall, Looking very much out of place, and as if he hoped his condescension would be appreciated, but he doubted it, stood the uniformed functionary that usually confined his activities to the second-floor front, where the tips were large and the guests of unquestioned wealth, to say nothing of culture. He held in his hand a shining silver tray, on which lay 2 cards, and he delivered his message in a tone that not only showed the deference he felt for the one who had sent him, but compelled such deference also on the part of those to whom he spoke. "The lady and gentleman says, will the ladies come down to the private parlour as soon after breakfast as is convenient, room number 2, second floor front." He bowed to signify that his mission was completed, and that if it did not carry through, it was entirely beyond his sphere to do more. Luella grasped the cards and smothered an exclamation of delight. "Second floor front," gasped her mother. "The private parlour. Did you hear, Luella?" But Luella was standing by the one window, frowning over the cards. One was written and one engraved, a lady's and a gentleman's cards. Miss Ward, Mr. Donald Ward Grant. "For the land's sake, Ma, who in life are they? Do you know any Miss Ward? You don't suppose it's that lovely grey silk woman? Miss Ward, Donald Ward Grant. Who can they be, and what do you suppose they want?" "Grant, Donald Grant. Where have I... Why? Oh, horrors, Ma! It can't be that dreadful cousin has followed us up, can it? Donald Grant is his name, of course. Yes, Donald Ward Grant. It was the Ward that threw me off. But who was the other? Miss Ward. Ma, you don't! Luella Burton, that's just what it is. It's your Aunt Crete and that dreadful cousin. Crete never did have any sense, if she is my sister. But just let me get speech of her. If I don't make her writhe, I think I'll find a way to make her understand." Luella's expansive bravery beneath the row of biscuit puffs seemed to shrink and cringe as she took in the thought. "Oh, Ma!" she groaned. "How could she? And here of all places! To come here and mortify me! It is just too dreadful! Ma, it can't be true! Aunt Crete would never dare! And where would she get the money? She hasn't a cent of her own, has she? You didn't go and leave her money, did you?" "No, only a little change in my old pocketbook. It wouldn't have been enough to come down here on, unless she bought a day excursion. Wait, I did leave $5 to pay the grocer bill with, but Crete surely wouldn't take that. Still, there's no telling. She always was a kind of child. Oh dear, what shall we do?" The mother sat down on the tumbled bed beside the tray of Luella's cheap trunk. "Well, we must do something, that's certain, if we have to run away again. It would never do to have those two appear here now. Mercy, think of Aunt Crete in her old black and white silk, sitting next table to that lovely lady in grey. I should simply sink through the floor." "We can't run away, Luella," snapped the practical mother. "We've paid for our room 2 weeks ahead. I didn't want to do that, but you thought if Aunt Crete should get any nonsense into her head about our coming home, we could tell her we'd paid for the room, and that would settle it with her. So now it's done, and we can't afford not to abide by it. Besides, what good would that do? We can't afford to go anywhere but home, and that would be as bad as it was in the first place. We've got to think it out. If I just had hold of Crete a minute, I'd make her fix it up. She'd have to think some way out of it herself without any of my help, to pay her for her stupidity in coming. I can't understand how she'd do it." "I didn't think she'd dare," glared Luella, with no pleasant expression on her face. "I'll tell you what we'll have to do, Luella," said her mother. "We'll slip down those stairs in the back hall. I went down one day and they go right out onto the piazza that runs in front of the dining room. We'll just slip in the back door and get our breakfast right away. It's getting pretty late. You'd better hurry. They've likely come up from town on that very early train, and they'll sit and wait for us. We'll ring for a messenger bellboy and send down a note that my ankle is so much worse I can't come downstairs and you can't leave me. We'll say, 'Mrs. Burton and Miss Burton regret that they cannot come down as requested, but Mrs. Burton is confined to her bed by a sprained ankle, and her daughter cannot leave her. Miss Ward will have to come up.' You write it on one of your visiting cards, Luella, and we'll send it down as quick as we get back from breakfast. Hurry up." The only thing about it will be that climb up 3 flights after breakfast, but it won't do for us to risk the elevator. Crete might recognise us, for the elevator goes right by that second-floor front parlour. What I don't understand is how they got in there. It's only rich people can afford that. But land, Crete's just like a baby, hasn't been out in the world ever, and very likely she never asked how much the rooms were, but just took the best she could lay eyes on. Or more likely it's a mistake, and she's sitting in that little reception room down on the office floor, and thinks it the second floor because she came up such a long flight of steps from the sidewalk. We'll have to tell the bellboy to hunt up the fellow that brought up their cards and take it to the same folks. Come on now, Luella, and go slow when you turn corners. There's no telling but they might be prowling round trying to hunt us, so keep a lookout. Thus, by devious and back ways, they descended to a late breakfast and scuttled up again without being molested. Luella wrote the note on her card as her mother dictated, and a small boy, all brass buttons, was dispatched with careful directions, and then the two retired behind their ramparts and waited. Time went by until half an hour had elapsed since they came back from breakfast. They had listened anxiously to every footfall in the hall, and part of the time Luella kept the door open a crack with her ear to it. Their nerves were all in a quiver. When the chambermaid arrived, they were fairly feverish to get her out of the way. If Aunt Crete should come while she was in the room, it might get all over the hotel what kind of relatives they had. Mrs. Burton suggested to the chambermaid that she leave their room till last, as they wanted to write some letters before going out, but the maid declared she must do the room at once or not at all. The elevator slid up and down around the corner in the next hall. They heard a footfall now and then, but none that sounded like Aunt Crete's. They rang again for the office boy, who declared he had delivered the message in the second floor front, and that the lady and gentleman were both in, and said, "All right." He vanished impudently without waiting for Luella's probing questions, and they looked at each other in anxiety and indignation. "It is too mean, Ma, to lose this whole morning. I wanted to go in bathing," complained Luella. "And now no telling how long I'll have to stick in this dull room. I wish Aunt Crete was in Halifax. Why couldn't I have some nice relatives like that lovely old grey silk lady and her son?" Just then the elevator clanged open and shut, and steps came down the hall. It certainly was not Aunt Crete. Luella flew to the door at the first tap, and there, submerged in a sheaf of American Beauty roses, stood the functionary from the lower floor, with a less pompous manner than he had worn before. The roses had caused his respect for the occupants of the fourth floor back to rise several degrees. Luella stood speechless in wonder, looking first at the roses and then at the servant. Such roses had never come into her life before. Could it be? Must it be? But a miserable mistake. Then the servant spoke. "Miss Ward sends de flowers, and is sorry de ladies ain't well. She send her regrets and say she can't come to see de ladies count of a drive she'd promised to take today, in which she'd hoped to have de ladies' company. She hopes de ladies be better this evening." He was gone, and the mother and daughter faced each other over the roses, bewilderment and awe in their faces. "What did he say, Luella? Who sent those roses? Miss Ward? Luella, there's some mistake. Aunt Crete couldn't have sent them. She wouldn't dare. Besides, where would she get the money? It's perfectly impossible. It can't be Aunt Crete after all. It must be someone else with the same name. Perhaps Donald has picked someone up here in the hotel. You can't tell. Or perhaps it isn't our Donald at all. It's likely there's other Donald Grants in the world. What we ought to have done was go down at once and find out, and not skulk in a corner. But you're always in such a hurry to do something, Luella. There's no telling at all who this is now. It might be those folks you admired so much, though what on earth they should have sent their cards to us for, and those lovely roses, I'm sure I don't know. Now, Ma, you needn't blame me. It was you proposed sending that note down. You know it was, Mother, and of course I had to do what you said. I was so upset anyway, I didn't know what was what. But now, you see, perhaps you've cut me out of a lovely day. We might have gone on a ride with them." "Luella," her mother broke in sharply, "if you talk another word like that, I'll take the next train back home. You don't know what you are talking about. It may be Aunt Crete after all, and a country cousin for all you know. And, if it is, would you have wanted to go driving in the face of the whole hotel, with like as not some old shin-and-bones horse and a broken-down carriage?" Luella was silenced for the time, and the room settled into gloomy meditation. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. An Embarrassing Meeting. Meantime, Aunt Crete, in the whitest of her white, was settling herself comfortably on the grey cushions of the fringed phaeton again, relief and joy mingled in her countenance. It was not that she was glad that Carrie's ankle was so bad, but that she was to have another short reprieve before her pleasure was cut off. Soon enough, she thought, would she be destined to sit in the darkened room and minister to her fussy sister, while Luella took her place in the carriages and automobiles with her handsome young cousin, as young folks should do, of course. But oh, it was good that a tired old lady, who had worked hard all her life, could yet have had this bit of a glimpse of the brighter side of life before she died. It would be something to sit and think over as she scraped potatoes for dinner, or picked over blackberries for jam, or patiently sewed on val lace for Luella. It would be an event to date from, and she could fancy herself mildly saying to Mrs. Judge Waters, when she sat beside her sometime at missionary meeting, if she ever did again, "When my nephew took me down to the shore," etc. She never knew just what to talk about when she sat beside Mrs. Judge Waters, but here was a topic worth laying before such a great lady. Well, it was something to be thankful for, and she resolved she just would not think of poor Carrie and Luella until her beautiful morning was over. Then she would show such patience and gratitude as would fully make up to them for her one more day of pleasure. It was Donald, of course, who had suggested the roses. When the message came from the fourth floor back, Aunt Crete had turned white about the mouth, and her eyes had taken on a frightened, hunted look, while the double V in her forehead flashed into sight for the first time since they had reached the Atlantic coast. He saw at once in what terror Aunt Crete held her sister and niece, and his indignation arose in true Christian fashion. He resolved to place some nice hot coals on the heads of his unpleasant relatives and run away with dear Aunt Crete again, hence the roses and the message, and Aunt Crete was fairly childish with pleasure over them when he finally persuaded her that it would be all right to send these in place of going up herself as she had been bidden. She listened eagerly as Donald gave careful directions for the message, and the stately functionary respectfully repeated the words with his own high-sounding inflection. It made the pink come and go again in Aunt Crete's cheeks, and she felt that Luella and Carrie could not be angry with her after these roses, and especially when everything was being done up in so nice, stylish a manner. The drive was one long dream of bliss to Aunt Crete. They went miles up the coast and took lunch at a hotel much grander than the one they had left, so that when they returned in the afternoon, Aunt Crete felt much less awe of the Traymore, her experience in hotels having broadened. They also met some friends of Donald's, a professor from his alma mater, who, with his wife, was just returning from a trip to Europe. The bathers were making merry in the waves as they returned, and Aunt Crete's wistful look made Donald ask whether she felt too tired to take another dip, but she declared she was not one bit tired. She came from her bath with shining eyes and triumphant mien. Whatever happened now, she had been in bathing twice. She felt like quite an experienced bather, and she could dream of that wonderful experience of being lifted high above the swells in Donald's strong young arms. She obediently took her nap and surrendered herself to the hands of the maid to have the finishing touches put to her toilet. It was the soft grey voile that she elected to wear tonight, and Donald admired her when she emerged from her room in the dress, looking every inch a lady. A knock sounded at the door before he had had time to give Aunt Crete a word of his admiration, but his eyes had said enough, and she felt a glow of humble pride in her new self, the self that he had created out of what she had always considered an unusually plain old woman. With the consciousness of her becoming attire upon her, she turned with mild curiosity to see who had knocked, and behold, her sister and niece stood before her. The day had been passed by them in melancholy speculations and the making and abandoning of many plans of procedure. After careful deliberation, they at last concluded that there was nothing to be done but go down and find out who these people really were, and if possible allay the ghost of their fears and set themselves free from their dull little room. "If it should be Aunt Crete and Donald, we'll just settle them up and send them off at once, won't we, Mother?" "Certainly," said Mrs. Burton with an angry snap to her eyes. "Trust me to settle with your Aunt Crete if it's really her. But I can't think it is. It isn't like Crete one bit to leave her duty. She's got a lot of work to do, and she never leaves her work till it's done. It must be someone else. What if it should be those folks you admire so much? I've been thinking. We had some New York cousins by the name of Ward. It might be one of them, and Donald might have gone to them first, and they've brought him down here. I can't think he's very much, though. But we'll just hope for the best, anyway, till we find out. If it's Aunt Crete, I shall simply talk to her till she's brought to her senses and make her understand that she's got to go right home. I'll tell her how she's mortifying you and spoiling your chances of a good match, perhaps." "Oh, Ma!" giggled Luella in admiration. "I'll tell her she must tell Donald she's got to go right home, that the sea air don't agree with her one bit, it goes to her head or something like that, and then we'll make him feel it wouldn't be gallant in him not to take her home. That's easy enough if 'tis them." "But Ma, have you thought about your sprained ankle? How'll they think you got over so quick? Supposing it shouldn't be Aunt Crete?" "Well, I'll tell her the swelling's gone down, and all of a sudden something seemed to slip back into place again, and I'm all right." This was while they were buttoning and hooking each other into their best and most elaborate garments for the peradventure that the people they were to meet might prove to be of patrician class. They had been somewhat puzzled how to find their possible relatives after they were attired for the advance on the enemy, but consultation with the functionary in the office showed them that, whoever Miss Ward and Donald Grant might be, they were surely at present occupying the apartments on the second-floor front. For one strenuous moment, after the elevator had left them before the door of the private parlour, they had carefully surveyed each other, fastening a stubborn hook here, putting up a stray rebellious lock there, patting a puff into subordination. Mrs. Burton was arrayed in an elaborate tucked and puffed and belaced lavender muslin, whose laborious design had been attained through hours of the long winter evenings past. Luella wore what she considered her most fetching garment, a long, scant, high-waisted robe of fire-red crepe, with nothing to relieve its glare, reflected in staring hues in her already much burned nose and cheeks. Her hair had been in preparation all the afternoon, and looked as if it was carved in waves and puffs out of black walnut, so closely was it beset with that most noticeable of all invisible devices, an invisible net. They entered, and stood face to face with the wonderful lady in the grey gown, whose every line and graceful fold spoke of the skill of a foreign tailor. And then, strange to say, it was Aunt Crete who came to herself first. Perfectly conscious of her comely array, and strong in the strength of her handsome nephew who stood near to protect, she suddenly lost all fear of her fretful sister and bullying niece, and stepped forward with an unconscious grace of welcome that must have been hers all the time, or it never would have come to the front in this crisis. "Why, here you are at last, Luella. How nice you look in your red crepe. Why, Carrie, I'm real glad you've got better so you could come down. How is your ankle? And here is Donald. Carrie, can't you see Hannah's looks in him?" Amazement and embarrassment struggled in the faces of mother and daughter. They looked at Aunt Crete, and they looked at Donald, and then they looked at Aunt Crete again. It couldn't be. It wasn't. Yet it was the voice of Aunt Crete, kind and forgiving, and always thoughtful for everyone, yet with a new something in it. Or was it rather the lack of something? Yes, that was it, the lack of a certain servile something that neither Luella nor her mother could name, yet which made them feel strangely ill at ease with this new old Aunt Crete. They looked at each other bewildered, and then back at Aunt Crete again, tracing line by line the familiar features in their new radiance of happiness, and trying to conjure back the worried V in her forehead and the slinky sag of her old gowns. Was the world turned upside down? What had happened to Aunt Crete? "Upon my word, Lucretia Ward, is it really you?" exclaimed her sister, making a wild dash into the conversation, determined to right herself and everything else if possible. She felt like a person suddenly upset in a canoe, and she struggled wildly to get her footing once more, if there was any solid footing anywhere, with her sister Crete standing there calmly in an imported gown, her hair done up like a fashion plate, and a millionaire's smile on her pleasant face. But Luella was growing angry. What did Aunt Crete mean by masquerading round in that fashion and making them ashamed before this handsome young man? And was he really their Western cousin? Luella felt that a joke was being played upon her, and she always resented jokes, at least unless she played them herself. Then Donald came to the front, for he feared for Aunt Crete's poise. She must not lose her calm dignity and get frightened. There was a sharp ring in the other aunt's voice, and the new cousin looked unpromising. "And is this my Aunt Carrie? And my cousin Luella?" He stepped forward and shook hands pleasantly. "I am glad to be able to speak with you at last," he said as he dropped Luella's hand, "though it's not the first time I've seen you, nor heard your voice either, you know." Luella looked up puzzled, and tried to muster her scattered graces and respond with her ravishing society air, but somehow the ease and grace of the man before her overpowered her. And was he really her cousin? She tried to think what he could mean by having seen and talked with her before. Surely he must be mistaken, or perhaps he was referring to the glimpse he had of her when Mr. Grandon bowed the evening before. She tossed her head with a kittenish movement and arched her poorly pencilled eyebrows. "Oh, how is that?" she asked, wishing he had not been quite so quick to drop her hand. It would have been more impressive to have had him hold it just a second longer. "Why, I saw you the morning you left your home, as I was getting out of the train. You were just entering, and you called out of the window to a young lady in a pony cart. You wore a light kind of a yellowish suit, didn't you? Yes, I was very sure it was you." He was studying her face closely, a curious twinkle in his eyes, which might or might not have been complimentary. Luella could not be sure. The colour rose in her cheeks and neck, and up to her black walnut hair, till the red dress and the red face looked all of a flame. She suddenly remembered what she had called out to the young lady in the pony cart, and she wondered whether he had heard or noticed. "And then," went on her handsome persecutor, "I had quite a long talk with you over the telephone, you know." "What?" gasped Luella. "Was that you? Why, you must be mistaken. I never telephoned to you. That is, I couldn't get anyone to the phone." "What's all this about, Luella?" questioned her mother sharply, but Donald interposed. "Sit down, Aunt Carrie. We are so excited over meeting you at last that we are forgetting to be courteous." He shoved forth a comfortable chair for his aunt, and another for the blushing, overwhelmed Luella, and then he took Aunt Crete's hands lovingly, and gently pushed her backward into the most comfortable rocker in the room. "It's just as cheap to sit down, dear aunt," he said, smiling. "And you know you've had a pretty full day, and must not get tired for tonight's concert at the casino. Now, Aunt Carrie, tell us about your ankle. How did you come to sprain it so badly, and how did it get well so fast? We were quite alarmed about you. Is it really better? I am afraid you are taxing it too much to have come down this evening. Much as we wanted to see you, we could have waited until it was quite safe for you to use it, rather than have you run any risks." Then it was the mother's turn to blush, and her thin, somewhat colourless face grew crimson with embarrassment. "Why, she began. "That is, Luella was working over it, rubbing it with liniment, and all of a sudden she gave it a sort of a little pull, and something seemed to give way with a sharp pain, and then it came all right, as good as ever. It feels a little weak, but I think by morning it'll be all right. I think some little bone got out of place, and Luella pulled it back in again. My ankles have always been weak anyway. I suffer a great deal with them in going about my work at home." "Why, Carrie," said Aunt Crete, leaning forward with troubled reproach in her face, "you never complained about it." A dull red rolled over Mrs. Burton's thin features again, and receded, leaving her face pinched and haggard-looking. She felt as if she was seeing visions. This couldn't be her own sister, all dressed up so, and yet speaking in the old sympathetic tone. "Oh, I never complain, of course. It don't do any good." The conversation was interrupted by another tap on the door. Donald opened it and received a large express package. While he was giving some orders to the servant, Mrs. Burton leaned forward and said in a low tone to her sister, "For goodness sake, Lucretia Ward, what does all this mean? However did you get tricked out like that?" Then Donald's clear voice broke in upon them as the door closed once more, and Luella watched him curiously cutting with eager, boyish haste the cords of the express package. "Aunt Crete, your cloak has come. Now we'll all see if it's becoming." "Bless the boy," said Aunt Crete, looking up with delighted eyes. "Cloak? What cloak? I'm sure I've got wraps enough now. There's the cloth coat, and the silk one, and that elegant black lace." "No, you haven't. I saw right off what you needed when we went out in the auto last night, and I telephoned to that Miss Brower up in the city this morning, and she's fixed it all up. I hope you'll like it." With that he pulled the cover off the box, and brought to view a long, full evening cloak of pale pearl-coloured broadcloth, lined with white silk, and a touch about the neck of black velvet and handsome creamy lace. He held it up at arm's length admiringly. "It's all right, Aunt Crete. It looks just like you. I knew that woman would understand. Stand up and let's see how you look in it, and then after dinner we'll take a little spin around the streets to try you in it." Aunt Crete, blushing like a pretty girl, stood up, and he folded the soft garment about her in all its elegant richness. She stood just in front of the full-length mirror, and could not deny to herself that it was becoming. But she was getting used to seeing herself look well, and was not so much overpowered with the sight as she was with the tender thought of the boy that had got it for her. She forgot Carrie and Luella and everything but that Donald had gone to great trouble and expense to please her, and she just turned around and put her two hands, one on each of his cheeks, standing on her tiptoes to reach him, and kissed him. He bent and returned the kiss laughingly. "It's lots of fun to get you things, Aunt Crete," he said. "You always like them so much." "It is beautiful, beautiful," she said, looking down and smoothing the cloth as tenderly as if it had been his cheek. "It's much too beautiful for me. Donald, you will spoil me." "Yes, I should think so," sniffed Luella, as if offering an apology in some sort for her childish aunt. "A little spoiling won't hurt you, dear aunt," said Donald seriously. "I don't believe you've had your share of spoiling yet, and I mean to give it to you if I can. Doesn't she look pretty in it, Cousin Luella? Come now, Aunt Carrie, I suppose it's time to go down to dinner, or we shan't get through in time for the fun. Are you sure your ankle is quite well? Are you able to go to the casino tonight? I've tickets for us all. Sousa's orchestra is to be there, and the programme is an unusually fine one." Luella was mortified and angry beyond words, but the chance to go to the casino, in company with Clarence Grandon and his mother, was not to be lightly thrown away, and she crushed down her mortification, contenting herself with darting an angry glance and a hateful curl of her lip at Aunt Crete as they went out the door together. This, however, was altogether lost on that little woman, for she was watching her nephew's face and wondering how it came that such joy had fallen to her lot. There was no chance for the mortified mother and daughter to exchange a word as they went down in the elevator or followed in the wake of their relatives, before whom all porters and office boys and even head waiters bowed and jumped to offer assistance. They were having their wish, to be sure, entering the dining hall behind the handsome young man and the elegant, grey-clad, fashionably coiffured old lady, a part of the train, with the full consciousness of belonging, yet in what a way! Both were having ample opportunity for reflection, for they could see at a glance that no one noticed them, and all attention was for those ahead of them. Luella bit her lip angrily, and looked in wonder at Aunt Crete, who somehow had lost her dumpiness, and walked as gracefully beside her tall young nephew as if she had been accustomed to walk in the eyes of the world thus for years. The true secret of her grace, if Luella had but known it, was that she was not thinking in the least of herself. Her conscience was at rest now, for the meeting between the cousins was over, and Luella was to have a good time too. Aunt Crete was never the least bit selfish. It seemed to her that her good time was only blooming into yet larger things after all. Behind her walked her sister and niece in mortified humiliation. Luella was trying to recall just what she had said about country cousins over the telephone, and exactly what she had said to the girl in the pony cart the morning she left home. The memory did not serve to cool her already heated complexion. It was beginning to dawn upon her that she had made a mighty mistake in running away from such a cousin and in such a manner. All her life, in such a case, Luella had been accustomed to lay the blame of her disappointments upon someone else, and vent, as it were, her spite upon that one. Now, in looking about to find such an object of blame, her eyes naturally fell upon the one that had borne the greater part of all blame for her. But, try as she would to pour out blame and scorn from her large, bold eyes upon poor Aunt Crete, somehow the blame seemed to slip off from the sweet grey garments, and leave Aunt Crete as serene as ever, with her eyes turned trustingly toward her dear Donald. Luella was brought to the verge of vexation by this, and could scarcely eat any dinner. The dessert was just being served, when the waiter brought Aunt Crete a dainty note, from which a faint perfume of violets stole across the table to the knowing nostrils of Luella. With the happy abandonment of a child, Aunt Crete opened it joyously. "Who in the world can be writing to me?" she said wonderingly. "You'll have to read it for me, Donald. I've left my glasses up in my room." Luella made haste to reach out her hand for the note, but Donald had it first, as if he had not seen her impatient hand claiming her right to read Aunt Crete's notes. "It's from Mrs. Grandon, Auntie," he said. "Dear Miss Ward," he read, "I am sorry that I am feeling too weary to go to the concert this evening as we had planned, and my son makes such a baby of me that he thinks he cannot leave me alone, but I do hope we can have the pleasure of the company of yourself and your nephew on a little auto trip tomorrow afternoon. My brother has a villa a few miles up the shore, and he telephoned us this morning to dine with them tonight. When he heard of your being here, he said by all means to bring you with us. My brother knows of your nephew's intimacy with Clarence and is anxious to meet him, as are the rest of his family. I do hope you will feel able to go with us. With sincere regrets that I cannot go with you to the casino this evening, Helen Grandon." For the moment, Luella forgot everything else in her amazement at this letter. Aunt Crete receiving notes from Mrs. Grandon, from whom she and her mother could scarcely get a frigid bow. Aunt Crete invited on automobile trips and dinners in villas. Donald an intimate friend of Clarence Grandon's. Oh, fool and blind! What had she done? Or what had she undone? She studied the handsome, keen face of her cousin as he bent over the letter, and writhed to think of her own words. "I'm running away from a backwoods cousin." She could hear it shouted from one end of the great dining hall to the other, and her face blazed redder and redder till she thought it would burst. Her mother turned from her in mortified silence, and wondered why Luella couldn't have had a good complexion. Studied politeness was the part that Donald had set for himself that evening. He began to see that his victims were sufficiently unhappy. He had no wish to see them writhe under further tortures, though when he looked upon Aunt Crete's happy face, and thought how white it had turned at dread of them, he felt he must let the thorns he had planted in their hearts remain long enough to bring forth a true repentance. But he said nothing further to distress them, and they began to wonder whether, after all, he really had seen through their plan of running away from him. It was all Aunt Crete's fault. She ought to have arranged it in some way to get them quietly home as soon as she found out what kind of cousin it was that had come to see them. It never occurred to Luella that nothing her poor abused aunt could have said would have convinced her that her cousin was worthy of her homecoming. As the concert drew near its close, Luella and her mother began to prepare for a time of reckoning for Aunt Crete. When she was safely in her room, what was to hinder them from going to her alone and having it out? The sister's face hardened, and the niece's eyes glittered as she stonily thought of the scornful sentences she would hurl after her aunt. Donald looked at her menacing face and read its thoughts. He resolved to protect Aunt Crete whatever came. So, at the door, when he saw emotion on his Aunt Crete's part to pause, he said gently, "Aunt Crete, I guess we'll have to say good night now, for you've had a hard day of it, and I want you to be bright and fresh for morning. We want to take an early dip in the ocean. The bathing hours are early tomorrow, I see." He bowed good night in his pleasantest manner, and the ladies from the 4th floor reluctantly withdrew to the elevator. But 15 minutes later, surreptitiously tapped at the private door of the room they understood to be Aunt Crete's. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Luella's Humiliation. The door was opened cautiously by the maid, who was doing Aunt Crete's hair, having just finished a most refreshing facial massage given at Donald's express orders. Aunt Crete looked round upon her visitors with a rested, rosy countenance, which bloomed out under her fluff of soft white hair, and quite startled her sister with its freshness and youth. Could it be possible that this was really her sister Crete, or had she made a terrible mistake and entered the wrong apartment? But a change came suddenly over the ruddy countenance of Aunt Crete, as over the face of a child that, in the midst of happy play, sees a trouble descending upon it. A look almost of terror came over her, and she caught her breath and waited to see what was coming. "Why, Carrie, Luella," she gasped weakly. "I thought you'd gone to bed. Marie's just doing up my hair for night. She's been giving me a face massage. You ought to try one. It makes you feel young again."
Said her affronted sister. "I shouldn't care for one."
Marie looked over Luella and her mother, beginning with the painfully elaborate arrangement of hair and going down to the tips of their boots. Luella's face burned with mortification as she read the withering disapproval in the Frenchwoman's countenance.
"Let's sit down till she's done,"
said Luella, dropping promptly on the foot of Aunt Crete's bed and gazing around in frank surprise over the spaciousness of the apartment. Thereupon the maid ignored them and went about her work, brushing out and deftly manipulating the wavy white hair and chattering pleasantly meanwhile, just as if no one else were in the room. Aunt Crete tried to forget what was before her, or rather behind her, but her hands trembled a little as they lay in her lap, in the folds of the pretty pink and grey challis kimono she wore. And all of a sudden she remembered the unwhitewashed cellar, and the uncooked jam, and the unmade shirtwaists, and the little hot brick house gazing at her reproachfully from the distant home. And she, here, in this fine array, forgetting it all and being waited upon by a maid, a lazy truant from her duty. Did the heart of the maid divine the state of things, or was it only her natural instinct that made her turn to protect the pleasant little woman, in whose service she had already been well paid, against the two women that were so evidently of the common walks of life, and were trying to ape those that, in the eyes of the maid, were their betters? However it was, Marie prolonged her duties a good half-hour, and Luella's impatience waxed furious, so that she lost her fear of the maid gradually, and yawned loudly, declaring that Aunt Crete had surely had enough fussing over for one evening. They held in their more personal remarks until the door finally closed upon Marie, but burst forth so immediately that she heard the opening sentences through the transom, and thought it wise to step to the young gentleman's door and warn him that his elderly relative, of whom he seemed so careful, was likely to be disturbed beyond a reasonable hour for retiring. Then she discreetly withdrew, having not only added to her generous income by a good bit of silver, but also having followed out the dictates of her heart, which had taken kindly to the gentlewoman of the handsome clothes and few pretensions.
"Well, upon my word, I should think you'd be ashamed, Aunt Crete," burst forth Luella, arising from the bed in a majesty of wrath. "Sitting there, being waited on like a baby, when you ought to be at home this minute earning your living. What do you think of yourself, anyway, living in this kind of luxury when you haven't a cent in the world of your own, and your own sister, who has supported you for years, up in a little dark 4th-floor room? Such selfishness I never saw in all my life. I wouldn't have believed it of you, though we might have suspected it long ago from the foolish things you were always doing. Aunt Crete, have you any idea how much all this costs?" She waved her hand tragically over the handsome room, including the trunk standing open and the gleam of silver-grey silk that peeped through the half-open closet door. Aunt Crete fairly cringed under Luella's scornful eyes. "And you, nothing in the world but a beggar, a beggar! That's what you are, a beggar dependent upon us! And you swelling around as if you owned the earth and daring to wear silk dresses and real lace collars and expensive jewellery and even having a maid and shaming your own relatives and getting in ahead of us, who have always been good to you, and taking away our friends and making us appear like 2 cents. It's just fierce, Aunt Crete. It's heathenish." Luella paused in her anger for a fitting word, and then took the first one that came. Aunt Crete winced. She was devoted to the Women's Missionary Society, and it was terrible to be likened to a heathen. She wished Luella had chosen some other word. "I should think you'd be so ashamed you couldn't hold your head up before your honest relatives," went on the shameless girl. "Taking money from a stranger, that's what he is, a stranger, and you whining round and lowering yourself to let him buy you clothes and things, as if you didn't have proper clothes suited to your age and station. He's a young upstart coming along and daring to buy you any, and such clothes! Do you know you're a laughing stock? What would Mrs. Grandon say if she knew whom she was inviting to her automobile rides and dinners? Think of you in your old purple calico washing the dishes at home and scrubbing the kitchen, and ask yourself what you would say if Mrs. Grandon should come to call on you and find you that way. You're a hypocrite, Aunt Crete, an awful hypocrite." Luella towered over Aunt Crete, and the little old lady looked into her eyes with a horrible fascination, while her great grief and horror poured down her sweet face in tears of anguish that would not be stayed. Her kindly lips were quivering, and her eyes were wide with the tears. Luella saw that she was making an impression, and she went on more wildly than before, her fury growing with every word, and not realizing how loud her voice was. "And it isn't enough that you should do all that, but now you're going to spoil my prospects with Clarence Grandon. You can't keep up this masquerade long, and when they find out what you really are, what will they think of me? It'll be all over with me, and it'll be your fault, Aunt Crete, your fault, and you'll never have a happy moment afterwards thinking of how you spoiled my life." "Now, Luella," broke in Aunt Crete solemnly through her tears, "you're mistaken about one thing. It won't be my fault there, for it wouldn't have made a bit of difference, poor child. I'm real sorry for you, and I meant to tell you just as soon as we got home, for I couldn't bear to spoil your pleasure while we were here. But that Clarence Grandon belongs to someone else. He ain't for you, Luella, and there must have been some mistake about it. Perhaps he was just being kind to you. For Donald knows him real well, and he says he's engaged to a girl out west, and they're going to be married this fall, and Donald says she's real sweet, and—" But Aunt Crete's quavering voice stopped suddenly in mild affright, for Luella sprang toward her like some mad creature, shaking her finger in her aunt's face and screaming at the top of her voice. "It's a lie! I say it's a lie! Aunt Crete, you're a liar! That's what you are, with all the rest!" And the high-strung, uncontrolled girl burst into angry sobs. No one heard the gentle knock that had been twice repeated during the scene, and no one saw the door open until they all suddenly became aware that Donald stood in the room, looking from one face to another in angry surprise. Donald had not retired at once after bidding Aunt Crete good night. He found letters and telegrams awaiting his attention, and he had been busy writing a letter of great importance when the maid gave him the hint of Aunt Crete's late callers. Laying down his pen, he stepped quietly across the private parlour that separated his room from his aunt's, and stopped a moment before the door to make sure he heard voices. Then he had knocked, and knocked again, unable to keep from hearing the most of Luella's tirade. His indignation knew no bounds, and he concluded his time had come to interfere, so he opened the door and went in.
"What does all this mean?"
he asked, in a tone that frightened his Aunt Carrie,
and made Luella stop her angry sobs in sudden awe. No one spoke, and Aunt Crete looked a mute appeal through her tears. "What is it, dear aunt?" he said, stepping over by her side and placing his arm protectingly round the poor, shrinking little figure, who somehow in her sorrow and helplessness reminded him strongly of his own lost mother. He could not remember at that moment that the other woman, standing hard and cold and angry across the room, was also his mother's sister. She did not look like his mother, nor act like her. Aunt Crete put her little curled white head in its crisping pins down on Donald's coat sleeve and shrank into her pink and grey kimono appealingly as she tried to speak. "It's just as I told you, Donald, you dear boy," she sobbed out. "I oughtn't to have come. I knew it, but it wasn't your fault. It was all mine. I ought to have stayed at home and not dressed up and come off here. I've had a beautiful time, but it wasn't for me, and I oughtn't to have taken it. It's just spoiled Luella's nice time, and she's blaming me, just as I knew she would."
"What does my cousin mean by using that terrible word to you, which I heard as I entered the room?"
Donald's voice was keen and scathing, and his eyes fairly piercing as he asked the question and looked straight at Luella, who answered not a word. "That wasn't just what she'd have meant, Donald," said Aunt Crete apologetically. "She was most out of her mind with trouble. You see, I had to tell her what you told me about that Clarence Grandon being engaged to another girl." "Aunt Crete, don't say another word about that!" burst out Luella, with flashing eyes and crimson face. "For mercy's sake, Crete, can't you hold your tongue?" said Luella's mother sharply.
"Go on, Aunt Crete. Did my cousin call you a liar for saying that? Yet it was entirely true. If she is not disposed to believe me either, I can call Mr. Grandon in to testify in the matter. He will come if I send for him. But I feel sure, after all, that that will not be necessary. It is probably true, as Aunt Crete says, that you were excited, Luella, and did not mean what you said, and after a good night's sleep you will be prepared to apologize to Aunt Crete and be sorry enough for worrying her. I am going to ask you to leave Aunt Crete now and let her rest. She has had a wearying day and needs to be quiet at once. She is my mother's sister, you know, and I feel as if I must take care of her."
"You seem to forget that I am your mother's sister too," said Aunt Carrie coldly, as she stood stiff and disapproving beside the door, ready to pass out.
"If I do, Aunt Carrie, forgive me," said Donald courteously. "It is not strange when you remember that you forgot that I was your sister's child and ran away from me. But never mind, we will put that aside and try to forget it. Good night, Aunt Carrie. Good night, Cousin Luella. We will all feel better about it in the morning."
They bowed their diminished heads and went with shame and confusion to the 4th floor back, and when the door was closed upon them, they burst into angry talk, each blaming the other, until at last Luella sank in a piteous heap upon the bed and gave herself over to helpless tears. "Luella," said her mother in a businesslike tone, "you stop that bawling and sit up here and answer me some questions. Did you or did you not go riding with Mr. Clarence Grandon last winter in his automobile?" Luella paused in her grief and nodded assent hopelessly. "Well, how'd it come about? There's no use sniffing. Tell me exactly." "Why, it was a rainy day," sobbed out the girl, "and I met him on the street in front of the public library the day I'd been to take back The Legacy of Earl Crafton and that other book by the same author." "Never mind what books. Tell me what happened," said the exasperated mother. "Well, if you're going to be cross, I shan't tell you anything," was the filial reply, and for a moment nothing was heard in the room but sobs. However, Luella recovered the thread of her story, and went on to relate how, in company with a lot of other girls, she had met Mr. Grandon the day before at the golf links, where a championship game was being played. She did not explain the various manoeuvres by which she had contrived to be introduced to him, nor that he had not seemed to know her at first when she bowed in front of the library building. She had called out, "It's a fine day for ducks, Mr. Grandon. Isn't it good the game was yesterday instead of today?" And he had asked her to ride home with him. That was her version. Her mother, by dint of careful questioning, finally arrived at the fact that the girl had done more than hinted to be taken home, having loudly announced her lack of rubbers and umbrella, though she seldom wore rubbers and had on a raincoat and an old hat.
"But how about the big box of chocolates he sent you, Luella? That was a very particular attention to show you, if he was engaged."
"Oh," pouted Luella,
"I don't suppose that meant anything either, for I caught him in a Filipino on the way home that day. We said the same words at the same time, something like, 'It's going to clear off,' and I told him when we girls did that, the one that spoke first had to give the other a box of chocolates, so the next day he sent them."
"Luella, I never brought you up to do things like that. I don't think that was very nice."
"Oh, now, Ma, don't you preach. I guess you weren't a saint when you were a girl. Besides, I don't think you're very sympathetic."
She mopped her swollen eyes.
"Luella, didn't he ever pay you any more attention after that? I kind of thought you thought he liked you by the way you talked." "No, he never even looked at me,"
sobbed the girl, her grief breaking out afresh.
"He didn't even know me the next time we met, but stared straight at me till I bowed, and then he gave me a cold little touch of his hat. And down here he hasn't even recognized me once. I suppose that lady mother of his didn't like my looks." "Look here, Luella, I wish you'd act sensible. This has been pretty expensive trying to run around after the Grandons. Here's the hotel bills and all that dressmaking, and now no telling how Aunt Crete will act after we get home. Like as not, she'll think she's got to have a maid and dress in silks and satins. There's one comfort, probably some of her clothes will fix over for you when she gets off her high horse and comes down to everyday living again. But I wish you'd brace up and forget these Grandons. It's no use trying to get up in the world higher than you belong. There's that nice John Peters would have been real devoted to you if you'd just let him, and he owns a house of his own already, and has the name of being the best plumber in Midvale."
Luella sighed.
"He's only a plumber, Ma, and his hands are all red and rough."
"Well, what's that?" snapped her practical mother. "He may have his own automobile before long, for all that. Now dry up your eyes and go to sleep, and in the morning do you go down real early and apologize to your silly Aunt Crete, and make her understand that she's not to disgrace us under any consideration by going in bathing while she's here. My land, I expect to see her riding round on one of those saddle ponies on the beach next, or maybe driving that team of goats we saw today with pink ribbon reins. Come now, Luella, don't you worry. Set out to show your cousin Donald how nice you can be, and maybe some of the silk dresses will come your way. Anyhow, this can't last forever, and John Peters is at home when we get there." So Luella, soothed in spirit, went to bed, and arose very early the next morning, descending upon poor Aunt Crete, while yet the dreams of sailing alone with Donald on a moonlit sea were mingling with her waking thoughts. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Aunt Crete's Partnership. Luella did her work quietly, firmly and thoroughly. She vanished before Marie had thought of coming to her morning duties. At breakfast time, Donald found a sad, cowed little woman waiting for him to go down to the dining room. He tried to cheer her up by telling her how nice a time they were to have in bathing that morning, for the water was sure to be delightful, but Aunt Crete shook her head sadly and said she guessed she had better not go in bathing any more. Then she sighed and looked wistfully out on the blue waves dancing in the sunshine. "Don't you feel well, Aunt Crete?" asked Donald anxiously. "Oh yes, real well," she answered. "Did it hurt you to go in yesterday, do you think?" "No, not a mite," she responded promptly. "Then why, in the name of common sense, don't you want to go in today? Has Luella been trying to talk some of her nonsense?" "Well, Luella thinks my figure looks so bad in a bathing suit. She says of course you want to be polite to me, but you don't really know how folks will laugh at me and make her ashamed of belonging to me." "Well, I like that," said Donald. "You just tell Miss Luella we're not running this vacation for her sole benefit. Now, Aunt Crete, you're going in bathing or else I won't go, and you wouldn't like to deprive me of that pleasure, would you? Well, I thought not. Now, come on down to breakfast, and we'll have the best day yet. Don't you let Luella worry you. And by the way, Aunt Crete, I'm thinking of taking a run up to Cape Cod and perhaps getting a glimpse of the coast of Maine before I get through. How would you like to go with me?" "Oh!" gasped Aunt Crete in a daze of delight.
Could I?
Then, mindful of Luella's mocking words the night before,
But I mustn't be an expense to you. I'd just be a burden. You know I haven't a cent of my own in the world, so I couldn't pay my way, and you've done a great deal more than I ought to have let you do.
Now, Aunt Crete, once for all you must get that idea out of your head. You could never be a burden to me. I want you for a companion. If my mother were here, shouldn't I just love to take her on a journey with me and spend every cent I had to make her happy? Well, I haven't Mother here, but you are the nearest to Mother I can find, and I somehow feel she'd like me to have you in her place. Will you come? Or is it asking too much to ask you to leave Aunt Carrie and Cousin Luella? They've got each other, and they never really needed you as I do. I've got plenty of money for us to do as we please, and I mean it with all my heart. Will you come and stay with me? I may have to take a flying trip to Europe before the summer's over, and if I do, it would be dreadfully lonesome to go alone. I think you'd like a trip on the ocean, wouldn't you? And a peep at London, and perhaps Paris and Vienna and old Rome for a few days. And in the fall I'm booked for work in my old university. It's only an assistant professorship yet, but it means a big thing for a young fellow like me, and I want you to come with me and make a cosy little home for me between whiles, and a place where I can bring my friends when they get homesick." He paused and looked down for an answer, and was almost startled by the glory of joy in Aunt Crete's face.
"Oh, Donald, could I do that? Could I be that to you? Do you really think I could be of use enough to you to earn my living?"
He stooped and kissed her forehead reverently to hide the tears that had come unbidden to his eyes. It touched him beyond measure that this sweet life had been so empty of love and so full of drudgery that she should speak thus about so simple a matter. It filled him with indignation against those who had taken the sweetness from her and given her the dregs of a life instead. "Dear aunt," he said, "you could be of great use to me, and more than earn anything I could do for you many times over, just by being yourself and mothering me. But, as for work, there is not to be one stroke done, except just what you want to do for amusement. We'll have servants to do all the work, and you shall manage them. I want you for an ornament in my home, and you are going to have a good rest and a continual vacation the rest of your life, if I know anything about it. Now come down to breakfast, so we can go in bathing early, and don't you worry another wrinkle about Luella. You don't belong to her anymore. We'll send her a parasol from New York and a party gown from Paris, and she won't bother her pompadour any more about you, you may be sure." In a maze of delight, Aunt Crete went down to breakfast, and dawned upon the astonished vision of her sister and niece in all the beauty of her dainty white morning costume. They were fairly startled at the vision she was in white, with her pretty white hair to match it. Luella gasped and held her disapproving breath, but Aunt Crete was too absorbed in the vision of joy that had opened before her to know or care what they thought of her in a white dress. No girl, in the new joy of her first love, was ever in a sweeter dream of bliss than was Aunt Crete as she beamed through her breakfast. Luella's looks of scorn and Luella's mother's sour visage had no effect upon her whatever. She smiled happily and ate her breakfast in peace, for had she not been set free forever from the things that had made her life a burden heretofore, and shown into a large place of new joys where her heart might find rest? After breakfast, Donald made them all walk down the boardwalk to the various shops filled with curios, where he bought everything that Luella looked at, and lavished several gifts also upon her mother, including a small oriental rug that she admired. They returned to the hotel in a good humour, and Luella began to have visions of luxurious days to come. She felt sure she could keep Aunt Crete down about where she wanted her, and her eyes gloated over the beautiful white dress that she hoped to claim for her own when they all went home, and she had convinced Aunt Crete how unsuitable white was for old ladies. She was quite astonished, after her morning talk with her aunt, to hear Donald say as he looked at his watch, "Come, Aunt Crete, it's time for our bath," and to see Aunt Crete walk smiling off toward the bathhouses, utterly regardless of her wrathful warning glances. It was rather disconcerting to have Aunt Crete become unmanageable right at the beginning this way. But In view of the fact that her hands were filled with pretty trifles bought by her cousin, she did not feel like making any protest beyond threatening glances, which the dear soul, whose mind was in Europe and whose heart was in a cosy little home all her own and Donald's, did not see at all. Aunt Crete was happy. She felt it in every nerve of her body as she stepped into the crisp waves and bounded out to meet them with the elasticity of a girl. Luella, following a moment later in her flashy bathing suit of scarlet and white, watched her aunt in amazement, and somehow felt that Aunt Crete was drifting away from her, separated by something more than a few yards of blue salt water. Donald kept up a continual flow of bright conversation during the noon meal, and managed to engage Luella and her mother on the long piazza in looking through the marine glass at a great ship that went lazily floating by, while Aunt Crete was getting ready to go on the ride. And before Luella and her mother were quite aware of what was happening, they stood on the piazza watching Aunt Crete in her handsome black crepe de chine, which even boasted a modest train, and her black lace wrap and bonnet, being handed into the Grandon motor car, while Donald carried her long new grey cloak on his arm. The grey car moved smoothly away out of sight, and Luella and her mother were left staring at the sea with their own bitter reflections. The automobile party did not return until late that night, for the moon was full and the roads were fine, and Donald saw to it that Aunt Crete was guarded against any intrusion. It was at breakfast next morning that Donald told them, and Aunt Crete sat listening with the rapt smile that a slave might have worn as he listened to the reading of the Proclamation of Emancipation. "Aunt Carrie," he began as pleasantly as if he were about to propose that they all go rowing, "Aunt Crete and I have decided to set up a permanent partnership. She has consented to come and mother me. I have accepted a position in my old university, and I am very tired of boarding. I think we shall have a cosy, pleasant home, and will be glad to have you and Luella come and visit us sometimes, after we get settled, and have some good servants, so that Aunt Crete will have plenty of time to take you around and show you the sights. In the meantime, it is very likely that I may have to take a brief trip abroad for the university. If so, I shall probably start in about a week, and before that I want to get a glimpse of the New England coast. I have decided to take Aunt Crete and run away from you today. We leave on the noon train, so there is time for a little frolic yet. Suppose we go down to the boardwalk and eat an ice cream cone. I saw some delicious ones last night that made my mouth water, and we haven't had that experience yet. We'll get some rolling chairs so that Aunt Crete won't be too tired for her journey. Come, Aunt Crete, you won't need to go upstairs again, shall you? I told Marie about the packing. It won't be necessary for you to go back until it's time for you to change to your travelling garb." In a daze of anger and humiliation, Luella and her mother climbed into their double rolling chair and ate their ice cream cones sullenly, propelled by a large, lazy-coloured boy. But Aunt Crete had a chair to herself and was attended by Donald, who kept up a constant stream of delightfully funny conversation about the people and things they passed that made Aunt Crete laugh till the tears came into her happy eyes. There was no opportunity for Luella and her mother to talk to Aunt Crete alone, even after they returned to the hotel, for Donald kept himself in evidence everywhere, until at last Luella made bold to declare that she didn't see why Donald thought he had a right to come and take Aunt Crete away from them, when they had always taken care of her, and her mother added in an injured tone, "Yes, you don't seem to realise what a burden it's been all these years, having to support Crete, and her so childish and unreasonable in a great many ways, and not having any idea of the value of money. I've spent a good deal on Crete, take it all in all, and now, when Luella's going out, and has to have clothes and company, it's rather hard to have her leave us in the lurch this way, and me with all the work to do." "That being the case, Aunt Carrie," said Donald pleasantly, "I should suppose you'd be very glad to have me relieve you of the burden of Aunt Crete's support, for it will be nothing but a pleasure to me to care for her the rest of her life. As for what you have spent for her, just run it over in your mind, and I shall be quite glad to reimburse you. Aunt Crete is really too frail and sweet to have to work any longer. I should think my cousin was almost old enough to be a help to you now, and she looks perfectly strong and able to work." Luella flashed a vindictive glance at her cousin, and turned haughtily toward the window. Then the porter came for the trunks, and the travellers said a hasty goodbye and flitted. As Donald shook hands with Luella in parting,
He looked merrily into her angry eyes and said, "I do hope, Luella, that it hasn't been too much of a trial to have your backwoods cousin spend a few days here. You'll find a box of bonbons up in your room, if the porter did his duty, which may sweeten your bitter thoughts of me, and we hope you'll have a delightful time the rest of your stay here. Goodbye." About 3 months after Donald had returned from Europe and settled to his Western university life, Aunt Crete received a letter from her sister. It was brief and to the point, and Aunt Crete could read between the lines. It read, "Dear Crete, aren't you about sick of that nonsense and ready to come home? Luella has decided that she can't do better than take John Peters. He has promised to buy an auto next year if the plumbing business keeps up. I think at least you might come home and help get her things ready, for there's a great deal of sewing to do, and you know I can't afford to hire it, and Luella's out so much now she's engaged. Do come soon. Your sister, Carrie." Aunt Crete looked sober, but Donald, looking over her shoulder, read and then went to his desk for a moment. Coming back, he dropped a check for $500 into his aunt's lap. "Send her that from me, Aunt Crete, and another from yourself if you like, and let her hire the sewing done. They don't want you, and I do." Aunt Crete had her own bank account now, thanks to her thoughtful nephew, and she smiled back a delighted, "I will," and went off to write the letter, for Aunt Crete was at last emancipated. End of Chapter 8. End of Aunt Crete's Emancipation by Grace Livingston Hill.